Having received the secret orders, I felt a tension building inside me comparable to the sensation before a parachute jump. Our U.S. Army Special Unit had been dispatched to search for a missing group of American scientists who had been studying strange phenomena in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Officially, the mission sounded like a standard rescue and evacuation operation. We were to determine what had happened to the research team and bring any survivors home. Yet it was made clear that there was something far more serious behind it all. Something tied to the Soviet past, unknown experiments, and potential anomalies. It was early 1999, a time when the world seemed on the brink of entering a new millennium. But as we delved into the assignment's details, it felt as though we were being sent back into the darkness of the Cold War. The briefing indicated that the scientists had been working near Pripyat, in areas where the radiation levels, although above normal, were considered relatively safe as long as proper protective protocols were followed. They were collecting samples of soil, vegetation, and animals, as well as studying the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. 3 days before our departure, all contact with them was abruptly lost. Their signal vanished without warning of any impending trouble. Our command center at the Pentagon received only alarming fragments of reports mentioning abnormal signs of mutation and references to an unknown Soviet-era laboratory. The last entries noted that the group was preparing to enter a structure about which no official information existed. I had been in hot zones many times before. Assault operations in the Middle East, reconnaissance missions in the most dangerous corners of the planet. Yet the thought that we were being sent into a nuclear disaster zone filled me with an unfamiliar dread. Radiation is an unseen enemy, not immediately perceptible. What was even more frightening, however, was what lay hidden in those reports, written in the feverish hand of scientists who seemed to have encountered something beyond the scope of conventional science. Our team was made up of seasoned fighters, and everyone knew that in these conditions there was no time for jokes. We were briefed on the necessity of chemical protection, regular dosimeter checks, and utmost caution when encountering locals or any unexpected stalkers. When I examined the provided photographs, tilted houses, rusting vehicles, and cracked schoolyards in Pripyat, a strange premonition overcame me. The images looked like the sets of an apocalyptic film. Our people had already worked in combat zones and seen cities in ruins, but those ruins were usually teeming with signs of life, even if it was just the presence of insurgents or civilians. Here, however, there was expected to be absolute silence and decay that had spread over decades under the oppressive weight of radiation and neglect. We were flown to Kyiv, where we were to collect vehicles, additional equipment, and review documentation left by colleagues from the embassy. The briefing ended with a quick yet tense assembly. Each one of us understood that the fate of not only the missing scientists, but possibly a hidden secret, the kind the government preferred to keep under wraps, hung in the balance. We had to move immediately, without waiting for any anomalous phenomena, should they indeed break out and capture widespread attention. In my pocket lay a printed map of the Chernobyl surroundings, riddled with the scientists' markings. Looking at it, I realized clearly our task was far more complex than it appeared. And although on the surface it was a standard rescue operation, my inner voice whispered that we were stepping into a territory where human logic could crumble beneath the weight of unknown terror. We arrived at Borispil Airport in the early morning. The cold wind immediately reminded me that it was January, a harsh month even here. Kyiv unfolded before us as a bustling metropolis, its skyline bristling with tall buildings and its streets filled with constant noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had landed on another planet. On one hand, we were surrounded by all the familiar signs of civilization: storefronts, streams of cars, hurried pedestrians. And on the other, the grim objective of our mission, shrouded in an ominous aura of radiation and abandonment. We received vehicles that had been prearranged by the diplomatic representatives and inspected our gear. Individual protective suits, dosimeters, filters, night vision devices, medical supplies, everything that might be needed to confront an unpredictable, radioactive environment. While we were unloading our equipment, I caught a few wary glances from some Kyiv locals. It seemed they recognized us as military personnel, even though we weren't wearing our uniforms openly. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but I noticed that whenever a passerby heard the word Chernobyl, their expression darkened, as though it stirred up a deep, unhealable wound. The drive through the city took several hours due to traffic and paperwork. We eventually received special permission from the Ukrainian authorities to enter the exclusion zone. It appeared that the local officials, though granting us a green light, did so reluctantly, almost as if they didn't want to involve foreigners in matters they had long wished to forget. Understandably, for them, Chernobyl was a national-scale tragedy, a symbol of pain and loss. I observed that my teammates were determined to stay alert. No one spoke above a whisper or made any jokes. Usually, before an operation, the guys would try to lighten the mood with anecdotes or brief banter. But now there was a restrained silence. We all felt a certain heaviness in the air, as if we were about to face an enemy of which we knew almost nothing. When we finally set out, the urban hustle gradually gave way to quiet suburban roads. The surrounding landscape looked typical for Eastern Europe: open fields, half-abandoned structures, and the occasional village. At the same time, I noted that the closer we got to the north, the rarer any signs of active life became. The bleak gray scenery evoked somber thoughts, and the clock on the dashboard relentlessly ticked the minutes away, drawing us nearer to the zone. At one point, I found myself listening intently to the hum of the engines as if searching for a premonition of trouble. Upon arriving at the designated meeting point, we connected with a local contact from the Ukrainian services. He relayed the final instructions regarding our route, advised us to be cautious when dealing with residents of nearby villages, and reminded us that radiation was unpredictable. You might safely drive on one road, but a turn onto a neighboring one could expose you to a massive dose. His eyes exuded professionalism, yet at times a flicker of anxiety betrayed his inner doubts. Doubts as to whether our mission would ultimately succeed, or perhaps fear that we might have to confront something he had spent his time trying to avoid. After a brief discussion, we set off. The soldiers checked their weapons and protective gear. Before departure, I glanced around. The noise of the big city was now behind us, and ahead lay a muted, cold silence. I felt my heart tighten at the thought of crossing that fine line between the world of the living and a territory many considered cursed. We approached a checkpoint on the border of the Chernobyl zone, where a sullen soldier clad in a heavy, worn coat greeted us. He quickly inspected our documents and scrutinized our faces as though trying to guess who we were and with what motives we had come. Then he waved us through, and the barrier lifted, allowing us entry into what is known as the exclusion zone. Outwardly, everything appeared ordinary. Rusted gates, a guard tower, and signs in both Ukrainian and English warning of radiation hazards. A local guide was assigned to us who agreed to accompany us to the first abandoned streets of Pripyat. Somber and taciturn, he merely glanced at our vehicles and offered a brief nod of greeting. His entire demeanor indicated that he was doing this out of duty rather than choice. I was unsettled by how quickly he surveyed our weapons and protective gear. It seemed he had seen many such groups before, most of whom never returned with smiles on their faces. We set off deeper into the zone along a narrow road bordered by dense forest. The dry tree trunks swayed in the wind like the skeletons of long dead giants. Soon we encountered a barely noticeable barrier, beyond which began what could only be described as deadland. The guide halted the vehicle and, glancing back over his shoulder, quietly informed us that he wouldn't be going any further. He said he could sense a bad omen in the air. I didn't try to dissuade him. His face bore genuine fear, and honestly, I understood why. The grim reputation of this place had long become a legend best left undisturbed by the locals. We exited the vehicles and donned our protective suits. I checked my dosimeter. The needle flickered lightly, but the readings remained within normal limits. A couple of other soldiers confirmed the same values. Still, even the sound of the dosimeter made my heart beat faster. That unusual sensation was a reminder that danger, unseen and omnipresent, could strike if we ever strayed from the correct path. We continued on foot. The checkpoint was behind us, and soon we found ourselves surrounded by the gray concrete boxes of abandoned buildings on the outskirts. The sun slowly rose, painting the sky in pale hues. The silence here wasn't absolute. The wind rustled through empty windows, infiltrating shattered glass, and somewhere in the distance, the creak of unsecured metal could be heard. All of it enhanced the impression that we had stepped into a time-frozen zone of catastrophe, where every small detail recalled a past from which people had long fled. After a short walk, we finally came upon a row of boarded-up houses. I noticed peeling Soviet slogans on the walls, faded posters, and unsightly graffiti. As soon as we took a few steps among these houses, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt as though we were intruding into a domain long abandoned, and the very place seemed to resist our presence. But we pressed on, understanding that somewhere here the scientists had vanished, and our task was to find out what had happened to them. We could not afford fear or hesitation. The mission was crystal clear: gather the data and, if possible, rescue any survivors. Along the way, I couldn't shake one thought. Why was the US government so obsessed with the disappearance of this group? Usually, if it were merely about radiation research, things would be simpler. A missing team would be replaced by another, and the search would be led by Ukrainian authorities. But here a hidden interest was clearly at play. Perhaps the scientists had discovered something that could shift our understanding of radiation or Soviet-era experimental research. In any case, we moved forward, trusting our training and equipment, hoping it would be enough to face the unforeseen. We ventured into a labyrinth of closely packed apartment blocks that recalled the bustling life of years past. In the inner courtyard, rusted frames of old playground swings were barely visible. Shattered glass crunched underfoot, and the walls of the entryways were coated in black mold and webs of cracks. It seemed that nature was already reclaiming this place from humanity, returning it to a wild state. Before long, one of the soldiers ahead signaled with his hand, pointing to the second floor of a nearby building. I glanced over and caught a vague silhouette flickering behind a broken window. It moved too quickly to make out any details. It could have been a shadow, a trick of the light, or perhaps someone was indeed slipping further into the apartment. My heart pounded even harder. We all tensed, yet none of us rushed in. Our objective was to locate the scientists' camp and understand what had happened to them. Unnecessary detours through empty apartments might delay the operation. But the sensation of being watched was nearly unbearable. After a few blocks, we finally noticed signs indicating a temporary scientific camp. A leaning tent, empty supply containers, abandoned equipment. Scattered all around were rain-soaked papers, a map marked with notes, and fragments of rubber hoses. It looked as though the people had left in haste, abandoning everything without a second thought for the consequences. I gathered a few documents and examined them. They mentioned radiation readings, unusual samples of animal tissues, and provided coordinates for an old Soviet building. Judging by the dates, these records were made just a day before the group vanished. On further inspection, we found traces of a struggle. An overturned generator, bloodstains at the edge of a tent, deep scratches on metal surfaces as if made by claws. Yet no bodies were found. It was as if the scientist had simply been dissolved into the environment. Then my eyes fell on large prints in the damp earth, elongated, about as wide as my palm. I had seen boar tracks in other parts of the world, but these looked unusually large. Moreover, they resembled something between a hoof and a paw, arousing vague suspicions of mutation. We pressed on, carefully inspecting the ruins and straining to catch every sound. The wind scattered bits of film across the ground, which fluttered against concrete steps, creating the illusion of light footsteps. I realized my legs were tensing to the point of cramping. We all felt an inexplicable anxiety, yet we continued step by step into the heart of the abandoned zone. As we advanced, increasingly strange details emerged. Melted pieces of metal, as if scorched by intense heat. Remnants of campfires with suspiciously large animal bones. Twisted debris that looked like parts of laboratory equipment. I sensed that our presence here wasn't merely dangerous. It might lead to the discovery of terrifying secrets that perhaps were best left hidden. Finally, we stumbled upon new tracks, paw prints leading to a massive building that resembled an old slaughterhouse. I cross-referenced these coordinates with the scientist's documents. It appeared that this location was marked as Point 12 in their notes. The reports mentioned that the scientist had planned to enter the building to investigate anomalous readings, but they had not managed to send a detailed report of their findings. I felt a heavy weight in my chest, as if the culmination of all the ominous hints we'd encountered was near. We contacted our team via radio to confirm positions and prepared to inspect the abandoned building, hoping to uncover at least some answers to the mounting questions. Approaching the massive gates, we examined the unyielding walls. Rust had eaten away every bolt and seam. The heavy door looked as though it hadn't been opened in years, yet inside, there lingered a sense of an alien presence. A plaque, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, attested that this had once been a meat processing facility. An old slaughterhouse, by the blueprints, had long been closed following the Chernobyl disaster. Yet why the scientists had focused on this place remained a mystery. We mustered our strength and pried open the creaking door. Inside, we were met by the hum of an empty space, amplified by the echo of our footsteps. Rusty hooks along the walls swayed slightly as if stirred by the air, and the floor was coated with remnants of something sticky and repulsive. Wires hung from the ceiling, and here and there broken light fixtures peeked through. Muddy water squelched beneath our boots, and somewhere deep within, there was a rustling as if rats were scurrying along the metal pipes. I stepped forward, peering into the darkness, and switched on my flashlight on auto. Its beam revealed soot-stained walls, battered tables, and broken equipment. Everything looked as though no human had set foot here for an eternity. Yet a faint odor, A mix of decay and dampness permeated the air, triggering a sense of revulsion and quickening my breath. We moved down a long corridor leading to the main workshop. There we discovered large, rusted conveyor belts that had once processed meat. Some parts of the conveyors were brutally torn apart, lying in heaps of twisted metal nearby. The entire area exuded an atmosphere of utter abandonment. But the real horror lay ahead. In the depths of one of the rooms, we heard heavy stomping, as if a large animal, alerted by our presence, had decided to check who had disturbed its rest. I took cover behind a concrete barrier and signaled for everyone to be on alert. Suddenly, a massive boar burst out of the darkness. In the beam of our flashlights, its skin appeared glossy and almost unnaturally sleek, and its head was disproportionately large, bearing unmistakable signs of anomaly. Above its snout, a third eye blinked blindly in the light. The beast let out a hoarse squeal filled with raw fury. Its size was horrifically disproportionate to that of a normal wild boar, and its hide was marred by lumps, clear indications of mutation. Gunshots rang out. The boar seemed unfazed by the bullets until one soldier landed a precise shot to its head. Even then, the animal did not immediately collapse. It convulsed wildly, its tusks scraping through the air, and only moments later did it fall, kicking up a cloud of dust and grime. When silence finally returned, we stood over its carcass, unable to look away from this grotesque marvel of nature. 3 eyes, tusks as long as my palm, a massive body. It was clear we were facing the result of a horrifying mutation, perhaps induced by the radioactive environment or some covert experiment. In the beam of my flashlight, I examined the ragged scars on the creature's hide, and a forbidden thought crept in, that someone or something had already been experimenting on these animals. Our group exchanged horrified glances. We all realized that we might have stumbled upon an echo of the very strange research mentioned in the missing scientist's documents. We decided to immediately return to the camp we had found earlier and set up a temporary shelter. We needed to catch our breath and process what we had witnessed. Despite the revulsion and fear, we understood this was only the beginning. The real nightmare might still lie ahead, deep in the abandoned zone, and now there was no doubt. An encounter with the unknown had become our reality, and we would have to continue down this path no matter how terrifying it sounded. We returned to the abandoned camp we had discovered earlier, heavy-hearted. The air reeked of a metallic scent of blood, and I couldn't shake the image of that 3-eyed boar from my mind. It seemed even the tattered tent fabric was imbued with a hidden terror. We spent the remaining daylight hours fortifying our makeshift shelter and rechecking our dosimeters. The radiation levels remained within acceptable limits, but the tension continued to mount, as if an unseen danger was constantly surrounding us. While a couple of soldiers were setting up extra signal traps around the camp, I inspected the area where we planned to spend the night. The tattered tarpaulin tents sat on half-rotted wooden pallets, and scattered around lay the same abandoned crates and containers. What struck me most was the absence of the scientists' bodies, neither living nor dead. Only here and there were stains that hinted at a fight or an attack. Perhaps those who survived met a fate even more horrifying than mere death. As dusk deepened, we gathered at the center of the camp. We switched our flashlights to power-saving mode to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. A heavy silence settled over the landscape, making every rustle seem almost deafening. For a time, a grim focus prevailed. In these conditions, the night watch had to be extra vigilant. After all, the enemy was unknown, and in the dark, it could move twice as quietly. We had no idea what other surprises this cursed zone might hold, aside from the terrifying mutants. Night fell quickly, as if someone had drawn heavy curtains over our camp. I took up a position behind a pile of rusted equipment and began scanning the area beyond the beam of my flashlight. At one point, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a vague silhouette slipping between the trees. I tensed up, pressing my weapon to my shoulder, but the object vanished. Perhaps it was just a trick of light and shadow. Still, my heart pounded, and the frantic clicking of my dosimeter in my pocket reminded me of the unfamiliar surroundings. Sleep came only in fragments. Horrifying sounds assaulted us, rustling as if something large was forcing its way through the thick brush at the edge of the camp, and quiet creaks that resembled soft sighs. I felt that every member of our unit was pushed to the limits of nervous tension. Even the most seasoned soldier was unprepared for this. Honestly, I prayed that the night would pass without any direct confrontation with unknown creatures. At dawn, we rose with the first faint rays of a cold winter sun. A light mist lay over the camp, and the air reeked of dampness and burning. Our first order of business was to inspect the boar we'd killed at the old slaughterhouse, but we discovered that its body had vanished. The spot where we had dragged the carcass now yawned as empty ground, with only a bloody trail stretching into the distance among the ruins. The notion that someone or something had removed such a huge creature seemed unnatural. I couldn't fathom what kind of force could have done it so swiftly and silently. Not lingering any longer, we regrouped in a hurry. I felt that every moment of delay brought us closer to an unknown threat. We had only one direction to follow, the one marked in the scientist's notes with the coordinates of an old secret laboratory. Deep down, I understood that there, we were likely to face something even more dreadful than what we had already encountered. But we had no choice. We had to move forward and try to shed light on the mystery of this deadly zone. We proceeded along a narrow road that wound between moss-covered building skeletons and sparse trees, desperately trying to break through concrete. Our dosimeters continued their slow clicking, yet the radiation levels remained within acceptable limits. I began to notice that the familiar hum of the wind had given way to a duller sound, as if we were inside a vast, empty room. The surrounding nature seemed lifeless, and that realization sent a shiver down my spine. After several hours, we emerged at the foot of a massive building towering over the surrounding ruins. It was a hulking structure of gray concrete, studded with rusted drainage pipes, with no obvious identifying marks. Only a few plaques in old-fashioned Russian indicated that some scientific organization had once occupied the building. Comparing with our coordinates, we realized this was the very Soviet-era laboratory the missing scientists had been searching for. We entered through the shattered main entrance and were immediately hit by the stale air, heavy with a musty odor. The walls were painted a peeling light green that exuded a sterile, hospital-like quality. Our footsteps echoed down the long corridors, and our flashlights revealed rows of doors with Russian plaques. Most of them appeared to be locked or barricaded from the inside. In some places, the floor was soaked with aged water, or a thick substance that looked like a mixture of machine oil and something organic. Soon we came upon a vast room resembling enclosures or cages meant for holding animals. Some of the cages had been sawed or broken off, as if someone from the inside had forced their way out. The iron bars were bent, as though subjected to the pressure of a hydraulic press. Seeing this, I vividly imagined the strength required to break free from such a trap, and a chilling fear stirred within me. Further on, we encountered a man huddled against a wall in a dark corridor. It was one of the missing scientists. His white coverall was torn, his face gaunt and covered in deep scratches. He fixed us with a wild, desperate look, a mix of terror and hope. His lips trembled, yet he did not utter a single word, as if he had lost the ability to speak. I couldn't help but feel pity for the poor fellow. He had clearly endured a nightmare he dared not recount. Through frantic gestures, he pleaded with us to leave that place as quickly as possible while pointing deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. We cautiously followed him, and it soon became clear that the scientist was trying to tell us. Something here was not an ordinary animal. With rapid gestures and abrupt motions, he indicated that a creature had wiped out all his colleagues and now roamed the maze of halls unchallenged. A chill ran down my spine. If the beast in this laboratory was powerful enough to scare off an entire team of scientists, then it was undoubtedly a serious threat to us as well. We advanced even more cautiously, switching off extra flashlights and straining to listen. With every step, it felt as though the walls were closing in, looming overhead as if warning us of the trials ahead. One question echoed in my mind. How were we supposed to get out of here alive and uncover what had really happened? Judging by the state of the scientist we had found, the darkest nightmare awaited us, one capable of undoing all our training and equipment with a single burst of bloodthirsty fury. We pressed on through corridors where every nook promised a new trap. The crackling of our dosimeters provided a somber backdrop, and our flashlights revealed only short stretches of concrete walls and metal doors reeking of decay. The scientist leading us suddenly stopped and pressed himself against a wall. His gestures grew frantic. He was signaling that the creature was nearby. A cold dread swept over us as a deep roar echoed from the depths of the laboratory. Even with the echo amplifying it, the sound was too loud and too low to belong to any ordinary animal. We exchanged grim looks, realizing we were nearing the source of the threat, yet our mission remained unchanged: to find survivors and gather information on the experiments. If we fled now, everything we had endured would be for nothing, and the monster would be free to roam unchecked. Then, a burst of noise came through the radio. Someone from our detachment, stationed in another part of the complex for defense, suddenly shouted, a voice breaking into a shriek. Amid the interference, we caught fragments of phrases. Giant silhouette and lightning-fast movement. The cry was abruptly cut off and a deathly silence fell. I felt the blood freeze in my veins. We had just lost a soldier, and we had no idea how or by whom. We broke into a run, navigating by the approximate coordinates of our fallen comrade. The labyrinthine corridors met us with gloomy passages, where our flashlights revealed only dim spots against the darkness. Finally, we reached a junction where we noticed fresh bloodstains and claw marks on the wall. Judging by the chaos around us, the attack had been ferocious. Metal panels had been torn away, and chunks of concrete lay scattered on the floor. Of our comrade, there was nothing left but shredded uniform fragments and blood trails that vanished further down the corridor. A hopeless anger welled up inside me. Our group, equipped with the latest technology, had encountered something unknown, and it was clear we were unprepared for such savagery. With every step, we tried to work more cohesively to maintain our field of view and not panic. But I could feel my nerves fraying. Every one of us knew that a single misstep could cost us everything. The atmosphere here was almost tangibly sinister. Mold clung to the walls like ancient warnings of a curse. At times, fleeting shadows seemed to distort our vision, appearing and disappearing as quickly as they came. The scientist we were with pressed himself against the wall, his eyes brimming with terror. It was as if he understood that we were approaching an inevitable confrontation with the very monster he had warned us about. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated nearby. Something massive was moving close by, its vibrations palpable even beneath our feet. I gritted my teeth and tightened my grip on my rifle. In the depths of one corridor, a gigantic silhouette flashed by, and for a split second, I caught the reflection of reddish eyes in my flashlight's beam. The creature dashed silently away, leaving us with trembling pulses and the stark realization that it was watching us and could strike at any moment. I realized then that the game was over. We had officially entered the monster's hunting grounds, and now it was no longer us hunting, but it deciding when and how to strike next. We regrouped at the entrance of a spacious hangar, inside which rows of leaning metal shelves stretched out. The sound of our footsteps echoed under the high ceiling. I felt cold sweat streaming down my back when I noticed vague movement ahead. We slowly advanced, maintaining formation. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own breathing, and my flashlight darted about, revealing shards of rusted equipment here and there, along with webs of wires hanging from the ceiling. Then I saw it in full. A creature resembling a cross between a wolf and a man. It stood on two massive muscular hind legs, while its front limbs ended in long, clawed digits. Ragged, patchy fur hung from its body, exposing deformed areas of skin, and its head resembled that of a predator with an elongated snout full of sharp fangs. The beast's eyes caught the flashlight's glow, reflecting a sinister red gleam. It appeared to possess a hint of intelligence, for it stood before us, tense and not immediately launching an attack. Perhaps it was studying us for a weakness. Someone fired a short burst from their rifle. The monster jerked, let out a low roar, and charged toward us, moving with surprising speed and fluidity for its size. The shots rang out almost in unison, their echoes fracturing into nervous reverberations. The creature slipped between the shelves and vanished into the darkness, and moments later, we heard a loud cry from the opposite flank. One of our soldiers had been swept away behind half-rotted crates, leaving behind nothing but a stifled scream and a deafening silence over the radio. We linked up in a chain, trying to prevent the monster from flanking us, but every turn of our head filled us with the dread that it might appear from behind in an instant. And then it did, suddenly emerging from the side, knocking two of us to the ground. I managed to catch a glimpse of its clawed limb digging into one of our men, and then the monster swiftly dragged the victim deep into a storage area. The sound was horrifying, the crunch of armor, followed by a cry that quickly turned into a pained rasp. I opened fire on the moving shadow, and this time I heard the bullet striking something solid with a resounding thud. The monster howled and bolted away, and in that brief moment I saw dark stains spreading along its side. It was clear. It wasn't invincible. If we executed our plan correctly, we could wound it, maybe even kill it. But each success came at a high cost. We had already lost several soldiers, and those still standing were on the brink of panic. Realizing that disorganized actions would lead to disaster, the remaining members coordinated their fire and unleashed a synchronized burst as the beast reappeared from cover. Bullets tore through the air, some finding their mark, and I heard an agonized roar of pain. The creature recoiled, clearly weakened. This was our chance to retreat to a safe position, regroup, and try to escape this cursed laboratory. We couldn't afford to lose any more lives in a senseless fight on enemy ground. When the monster, breathing heavily, disappeared down a dark corridor, I realized that only 5 of us remained. The faces of my comrades were contorted with a mix of horror, anger, and determination. We understood that this beast would not forgive our injuries and would seek revenge. But staying here meant inevitable doom. I shouted, pointing the direction of retreat, and we began pushing our way toward the exit, weapons at the ready. Blood, debris, and fear haunted every step, and the only thought pounding in my mind was, we must survive and escape while we still can. We burst out of the hangar into the main corridor of the laboratory, breathing in short gasps and constantly looking back, waiting for the monster to strike. But it did not reappear. Perhaps our gunfire and inflicted wounds had forced it to lie low, or perhaps it was biding its time. In any case, we decided it was time to leave. 5 soldiers were all that remained of our squad, and with us was the scientist we'd rescued, staggering, his eyes filled with terror. As we made our way back to the exit, we remained hyper-vigilant. In fragments, I couldn't help but wonder what had led to the creation of such a monster. The broken cages, the mentions of anomalies, it was evident that secret experiments on hybridization or mutation had been conducted here. Soviet scientists were likely trying to create something beyond an ordinary living creature. They were tampering with genes, radiation, perhaps even human DNA. And what they produced was this nightmare. We finally emerged onto the street, where a pale dawn bathed the gray sky in a dull light. The laboratory loomed behind us like a giant tomb hiding dark secrets. It felt as if the building itself was watching us through its empty window frames. I knew that inside lay our fallen comrades and that the monster could emerge at any moment. But there was nothing we could do. We lacked the strength and resources to continue the fight. After recovering from his initial shock, the scientist handed us several surviving documents. They detailed experiments with animal, and presumably human, DNA, accelerated mutations induced by radiation and chemical stimulants. Apparently, after the Chernobyl disaster, these projects were classified and officially terminated, but in reality, some experiments continued illegally. Perhaps our missing expedition had uncovered evidence and made contact with this creature, provoking its aggression. The others perished, and we barely managed to survive. Realizing that time was running out, we hurried toward the exit of the zone. We moved quickly, taking care not to make any noise that might attract other mutated creatures, which, as we now knew, could well be lurking about. Behind every abandoned building or rusted structure, I imagined those same red eyes emerging from the shadows. We were all at our breaking point. When we finally reached the checkpoint, we were met by startled soldiers, to whom we briefly reported what had happened. I looked at my emaciated comrades. They were alive, but their eyes seemed empty, as if we had left a part of our souls behind in that laboratory. After the necessary checks and formalities, we were allowed to leave the zone, but no one spoke a word. None of us had the strength left to recount the nightmare we had experienced. As we left the Chernobyl zone, I realized I didn't feel any relief. It was as if something was pulling me back, whispering that the monster was still there, perhaps healing its wounds, and that the secrets of those Soviet experiments remained far from fully revealed. We had only just lifted the veil on the possibilities of science that had gone too far. And though we were leaving, one question lingered. Could this creature ever break free of its concrete tomb and spread its terror further? Field experience taught me, if you don't eliminate evil at its root, it will return. And so, it was entirely possible that this story was not yet over. Story 2. I remember that cold wind seeping through the pines, the wind that whispered of my destiny to track the beast lurking in the darkness. Back then, I didn't know that by hunting monsters, one could become as much an outcast as they were. My name is James Mackenzie, and I am an aging hunter who's seen far too much in my 60-something years. With each passing day, I feel old wounds taking their toll. Yet there remains one mission I haven't completed. I have never stopped searching for the creature that destroyed my family. I knew I couldn't avoid the final hunt, the one where I would have to confront fear face to face. On the day I received news of new attacks, the sun was setting behind the distant ridges of Oregon, painting the western sky in somber hues. Reports detailed brutal incidents in the surrounding forests, torn-apart bodies, marks of teeth and claws that couldn't belong to ordinary predators. Local authorities were baffled, postponing decisions and blaming wolves for the misfortunes. But I suspected something else was behind these tragedies. It was hard to admit that legends might be frighteningly real. My hand involuntarily reached for the silver bullet hanging from a chain around my neck, a bullet that had once saved my life when I first encountered a werewolf. In the cab of my pickup, I listened to the engine purr as I climbed the narrow mountain road. Ahead, silent pine forests spread out like a dark sea, swallowing the faint light of the moon. I felt history repeating itself, the same tension in the air, that metallic taste in my throat, as if heralding an impending nightmare. My rifle lay on the seat beside me, loaded with old, trusted cartridges. I had once hand-loaded them, adding silver shot to pierce the hide of a beast unlike any ordinary wolf. I knew time was running out. Every full moon night brought a new victim, and I couldn't allow it to continue. I meticulously studied the map of the area, marking potential lairs. My heart tightened at the thought of facing once again that ghastly horror which had dragged my previous life into darkness. But I had no choice. I no longer wished to hear the cries of innocent people in the local papers. As I neared the outskirts of a small town, lost among the conifer slopes, my hands trembled noticeably. In these parts I was known only by rumor, a grizzled old hunter roaming the woods in search of mythical monsters. This was a harsh place, and its people were distrustful. Their skepticism meant little to me. What was at stake was far greater than mockery. I felt my final hunt drawing near, the hunt that I would either win at the cost of everything I had left or lose, taking the remnants of hope with it. That early morning, the fog enveloping me was thick and heavy, as if intent on hiding all the dark secrets of these lands. Stepping out of the dilapidated motel, I found an almost deserted street, a narrow road winding between low houses swallowed by conifer thickets. The air smelled of decay and damp pine needles, and memories of a bygone life surged through me, a time when I wasn't alone or embittered. I recalled my wife's face framed by golden curls and the laughter of my son Thomas, with whom I once went hunting. I remembered the gentle grip of his small hand and his delight with every animal trail we discovered. I never imagined that one day I'd lose it all. The tragedy struck when I had left town on business. A terrifying werewolf broke into our home and unleashed a bloody massacre. I arrived too late, witnessing only the mutilated bodies of my wife and daughter. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. Neighbors insisted the boy might have fled into the woods, yet no trace or clue was ever found. I clung to hope, desperately combing every slope and cave, but to no avail. The police dismissed his disappearance as the work of a wild animal, but I knew it was that very creature, the one I'd failed to catch, that had taken my son. Now, standing in an empty hotel room, the familiar feelings of pain and guilt surged back with renewed force. The local paper mentioned fresh cases, disfigured bodies of tourists, inhuman claw marks on pine trunks. People whispered about a curse, about supernatural beings roaming under the full moon. Most were too afraid even to discuss what was happening, yet some quietly claimed to have seen a beast as large as a brown bear, but moving on its hind legs. I couldn't help but think of my past. of the screams of victims and the tracks I had discovered many years ago at the site of that tragedy. Determined to learn the truth, I began questioning the few eyewitnesses, a mix of reclusive locals. Some who had lost a dog, others who found a torn doe lying by their porch at night. Most were reluctant to recall details. Yet I saw in their eyes that inexplicable terror. Deep down, I sensed history was repeating itself. Just as before, fear and despair permeated the air, and no one wanted to admit that a real monster had taken hold of these remote parts. As I listened to their stories, the image of Thomas, the boy who had mysteriously vanished, kept surfacing in my mind. I couldn't shake the thought that he was alive, caught up in something far greater than a mere hunting season tragedy. Perhaps I was mad, clinging to a faint hope. After all, no trace of his body had ever been found. I felt as though the ghost of the past was leading me down the same path as before, testing my battered nerves and demanding a courage I wasn't sure I still possessed. Late in the evening, after leaving the dusty streets behind, silence became almost tangible. The forest closed in like a colossal dark wall, an endless labyrinth of ancient trunks and tangled underbrush. My old lantern illuminated only a narrow strip of the path, just a few steps ahead. Beyond that circle of light, anyone could be hiding. Every snap of a twig underfoot echoed painfully in my chest, a stab of memory. The moist scent of pine and rotting leaves reminded me of nights spent hopelessly searching for any clue about my son's fate. At one turn along the ridge, I stumbled upon a ghastly sight: the remains of a torn-apart doe and numerous large tracks. The blood hadn't yet congealed, an ominous sign that werewolves had been nearby. A familiar terror gripped me, choking my throat. But I wasn't there to retreat. Retrieving a revolver loaded with silver bullets from my backpack, I gripped it so tightly that my knuckles went white. Among the trees, a figure flickered, perhaps just a shadow or a trick of the night's light. I couldn't tell for sure, but my heart began to race. Playing it safe, I pressed on, careful not to attract unnecessary attention. At night, the forest was deceptive, and I knew all too well how easily one could lose their way. The rustle of leaves and distant sounds merged into a continuous hum that sent shivers down even my battle-hardened spine. Yet I had no intention of leaving. I had to be sure that this pack truly existed. After another half-mile, I heard a muffled groan. Groping in the darkness, I eventually found the injured, a young woman lying at the foot of a tree. Nearby, deep cuts marked the ground, and stripped bark lay scattered, as if someone had thrashed wildly in a fit of rage. The woman was alive but unconscious, her wounds still bleeding. It was clear she'd been attacked by the very creatures I was hunting. I carefully bandaged her arm with supplies from my first aid kit, checked that her breathing was steady, and scanned the surroundings for any further threat. As night deepened, I had to figure out how to get the injured woman to safety. Leaving her there would be a death sentence for both of us. On the other hand, she needed immediate help, and the werewolves could return at any moment. Cautiously, I lifted her into my arms and, straining my worn back, headed back toward the road. Even through the pain and fear, I could see that this stranger was yet another victim of the beast spoken of only in rumors. On the way back to town, she began to regain consciousness, and for a brief moment, looked at me with a half-crazed gaze. From her whispered words, I deciphered one word: leader. That meant there was someone special in the pack, someone orchestrating these attacks. A chill seeped into my heart as I realized my path was opening to an even darker secret, with no turning back now. That night when I ventured into the forest again, The moon shone exceptionally bright. Its beams filtered through the towering trees like spotlights, accentuating every detail of the underbrush. Deep within, I heard muffled growls and the heavy movement of bodies. The werewolves were close, and I knew it might be a trap. Yet the thought that somewhere here lurked their leader kept me moving. I advanced cautiously, trying not to make a sound, brushing aside cobwebs and pushing through damp moss. Suddenly, everything fell silent, as if the forest itself had ceased to breathe. Then, a sudden fierce gust of predatory force struck, and I barely caught a blurred shadow before being knocked off my feet. I fell onto the wet ground, barely managing to raise my rifle. The impact sent pain through my entire body, ribs aching and ears ringing. Then a hoarse roar sounded beside me, and I realized I was at the edge. But I refused to give in. Instinct drove me to fight. In a split second, I pulled the trigger, and a flash of gunfire illuminated the night. The beast recoiled, letting out a mournful cry from its maw, and I sprang back to my feet. Yet I was immediately surrounded by several figures. They moved in the half-light, elusive, their eyes burning with inhuman fury. My heart pounded wildly. I knew I couldn't hold out for long against an entire pack. I tried to focus while reloading, but I could see their silhouettes closing in from all sides as low, threatening growls filled the air. Just when I thought it was all over, they suddenly parted. Emerging from the mass of bodies was a figure slightly taller than the rest, clad not in fur, but in what looked like the tattered remnants of clothing. Moonlight fell upon his face, and I froze in horror. Before me stood my son, Thomas, whom I had believed dead for years. His eyes blazed with wild fury, though beneath it flickered a spark of awareness. He was no longer the innocent boy I once taught to handle a hunting knife. Now he looked like a creature suspended between human reason and a cursed, bestial nature. My heart pounded even harder, and my throat went dry. I saw something familiar in his movements, as if he recognized me. Yet the eerie smirk on his face told me he felt no remorse for his new nature. It all felt like a nightmare. I wanted to wake up, but I couldn't. Thomas stared at me with predatory confidence, and the pack loomed behind him, ready to tear me apart at the mere gesture of his clawed hand. I couldn't manage a word, nor could I lower my weapon. In that moment, I realized the truth was 100 times more terrifying than my worst nightmares. My missing son had become the leader of the werewolves. And now, standing face to face with him, I felt the last barriers of my mind crumble. For before me was not just a monster, but a part of myself, forever tainted by the blood of the moon. I awoke by morning as the first weak rays of sunlight filtered through the branches. My ribs ached, scratches marred my face, and a dull pain pulsed in my head. It seemed the pack had decided not to kill me that night in the forest, perhaps because Thomas had recognized me, or maybe they deemed me too weak to pose a real threat. With great effort, I made my way to the road, trembling hands pulling a flask of whiskey from my pocket, taking a long sip. The alcohol burned my throat and set off bouts of coughing, but for a while it helped numb the shock of encountering my son, now a monster. Back in town, I returned to the same motel and tried to tend to my wounds. My thoughts were in disarray, constantly haunted by Thomas. His face twisted with inhuman malice, yet still unmistakably familiar. I knew the curse held him tightly in its grip. But what tormented me most was the question. Could he still feel even a fragment of the love that once bound us? Or had all humanity died along with the life that was ripped from us? One day I crossed paths with the young woman I had rescued. Her name was Emily. She was surrounded by nurses at the local hospital and looked terribly pale. I didn't speak with her, but I overheard that she was rambling about a man-beast and his pack, expressing gratitude to an unknown man who had brought her to town. Yet I felt no relief. The realization that I had once again confronted werewolves and discovered my own son among them tore at my soul. I saw myself as a pitiful failure, and that feeling dragged me deeper into despair. Still, summoning every ounce of will, I reread the old entries from the diary I had kept before the tragedy. There were sketches from the days when I first suspected the existence of inhuman predators. I hoped to find even a small clue that might help me save Thomas. Silver. That was the weapon against werewolves. But now Thomas wasn't just a beast. He was a cunning leader of the pack, organized and devious. There was no guarantee that a single silver bullet would solve the problem, especially if my hand trembled at the sight of his eyes. I kept wondering if I should see this through to the bitter end. Revenge and the duty of a hunter demanded that I rid the world once and for all of the monsters that were killing people. But my heart ached at the thought of having to shoot my own son, even if he had become a creature of nightmarish horrors. I felt torn apart, cursing the day fate set me on this path. By evening, I realized I couldn't simply hide and move on. I had to make a hard decision. I couldn't stand by while innocent lives continued to be lost. I knew a battle was inevitable, yet the pain of that potential ending grew more unbearable by the day. For several days, I prepared for the decisive confrontation. I studied the map of the forest roads, marked potential migration routes for the pack, and scouted suspicious caves and abandoned mines. Everything indicated that the werewolves chose places where they could hide by day and strike at night when their power surged under the moonlight. I spent sleepless nights gathering ammunition with silver cores and polishing the blade of my knife, testing its sharpness against the coarse hide of the beast. The night the full moon reached its zenith was especially ominous. The wind whipped through the treetops, filling the forest with an eerie rustle, and a palpable tension hung in the air, as if the very mountain peaks were preparing to witness a bloodshed. At that moment, I was at a predetermined spot, planning an ambush. I laid out bait, venison, and chunks of raw meat, hoping the scent of blood would lure the pack. I even rigged traps, though I knew werewolves could easily bypass them. As I lay in wait, memories from the past echoed in my mind, as if addressed directly to me. I could almost hear young Thomas calling me to walk by the river to search for frogs and little fish. I clenched my fists, mourning the loss of that peaceful life. Now here I was, lying in ambush against my own son, transformed into a nocturnal monster. The thought made my stomach churn, but I kept my eyes fixed on the target. I had no other choice. When the moon stood full above the firs, a terrible howl rang out over the ridge. It was the pack, and they were heading toward the town. My plan was to distract them, buying time for the townspeople to take cover, then lead the creatures into an open field. But things went awry. The werewolves either caught my scent or sensed the trap, and some bypassed my traps entirely. Muffled screams echoed from the direction of the town. The attack had begun. I raced toward the chaos, aware that time was nearly up. Arriving at the outskirts, I saw a toppled fence, mangled cars, and smashed doors of houses. A milk carton lay amid shattered glass, and bloodstains marked ruined belongings. The air was thick with panic, horror, and the stench of raw flesh. People fled in terror toward the mountain road, and I watched as werewolves emerged from the shadows, pursuing anyone who hadn't reached safety. My heart pounded as I realized a ruthless battle with these creatures was imminent. No longer could they be dismissed as mere myth. But more than anything, I had to face Thomas. Perhaps in one final act, I could spark even a glimmer of humanity in him, or finally end the curse that condemned us all to eternal fear under the blood-red moon. The red moon hung over the pine tree tops, bathing the ruined town in a bloody glow. I walked the deserted street, careful not to gaze upon the distorted bodies and shattered ruins. Each step sent a dull pain through my side, and my heart beat as if it might burst from my chest. I knew that somewhere out there, Thomas roamed with his pack, and I realized there was no room for error. There would be no salvation if I didn't stop him now. Reaching the central square, I saw two wolf-like figures on their hind legs emerging from behind the charred remnants of an old bar. They roared from afar, full of fury and bloodlust. In response, I raised my rifle and fired. A deafening crack rang out, and one of the creatures was thrown aside, howling in pain. The other lunged at me, knocking me to the ground as I felt sharp claws tear through my jacket. By some miracle, I managed to draw my knife and drive the blade into its side. With a wild growl, the werewolf recoiled, oozing black blood that seemed to glisten under the moonlight. At that moment, a terrifying roar boomed overhead, and looking up, I saw a familiar silhouette. Thomas stood atop the roof of a half-ruined building, watching the fray. His eyes shimmered with inhuman fire, and his movements exuded the confidence of a master of these lands. I struggled to rise, bandaging my bleeding shoulder as I stepped forward. He leapt from the roof with predatory grace, landing before me with the steely gleam of claws. For a moment we froze like two fighters in an arena. The fact that he was my son mattered little now. We shared the same blood. Yet the moon had transformed him into a creature of another order. He lunged at me so swiftly that I barely had time to raise my rifle. The shot rang out in tandem with his roar, the bullet slicing through the air in a smoky trail. Thomas flinched but did not fall, though I saw a trail of blood across his chest. He shoved me aside, and I was sent sprawling onto the pavement. Pain shot through my entire body, and blood gushed from my shattered lips. Every breath became a searing agony in my chest, yet I fumbled for the loaded rifle, grasped it, and forced myself to rise onto my knees. The final clash was brief, yet shockingly fierce. Thomas attacked, and I offered little resistance, as though my very soul had already surrendered. But in his eyes, in that fleeting moment, I saw a spark, a flash of recognition, perhaps even compassion. Then I pulled the trigger. The deafening report of the shot shattered the night's silence, and in the moonlight I saw my son's body stagger before collapsing. I struggled to stand, feeling a wound on my side gush with blood. Part of me died with him, as I endured that moment when the blood of the moon merged with the blood from my own wound. I awoke on a hospital bed surrounded by crisp white sheets and the sterile scent of antiseptic. The doctors said I had miraculously survived multiple injuries and severe blood loss. The town was recovering from the night's nightmare, the werewolf attack that left residents desperate to forget. Streets were cleared swiftly, the ruins were dismantled, and local newspapers described the events sparsely as an attack by wild beasts, carefully avoiding any mention of the supernatural. I felt utterly hollow. Despair overwhelmed any relief. Even though I had killed the pack's leader, likely halting the attacks, I had been forced to shoot Thomas, the only son I'd ever longed for. The memory of that moment tore at my consciousness like the fangs of a beast, haunting me day and night. Nurses and doctors looked upon me with pity, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the IV drip, its measured drops seemingly sentencing me to endless torment of guilt. According to the police, the surviving werewolves had vanished without a trace, and no one knew if they would return. The townspeople avoided asking questions, and they left me alone. It seemed they had silently decided that I was one of those who had saved them. Yet no amount of gratitude could silence the emptiness inside. I remembered teaching young Thomas to swing an axe at dry firewood, praising him for his accurate stone throws across the lake. Now those memories lay in ruins. A grim puzzle with a bloody moon at its center and the bestial nature that had stolen everything from me. When I was discharged, I gathered the few remaining belongings from the motel. The owner merely nodded briefly, as if understanding that there was no point in probing further. I climbed into my old pickup, glanced at the silver bullet hanging from my neck, and felt my lips tighten involuntarily. There could be no happy ending to this tale, but I hoped that at least other families had been spared a similar fate. Leaving town, I felt as if I were returning to where it all began, laden with emptiness and the weight of a lost past. Yet one thought never left me. Could Thomas have, for even a moment, rediscovered his old self when he hesitated before the final blow? Perhaps there still remained within him a spark of humanity that the curse hadn't completely smothered. But I would never know. I long ago abandoned the hunt, disposed of all my weapons, and dedicated myself to silent wandering along the roads, searching for solace from my memories. I no longer cared whether people believed in cursed beasts. The important thing was that I knew they existed and that someday they might return. But that battle was behind me. In the end, every soul carries its own guilt, and each must decide how to live with it. I chose a path where the sound of gunshots would never again ring out, and perhaps only in my memories will I forever fight for the son I failed to save.